In this segment, I'm going to talk about naming Microsoft Access objects, such as queries and tables. We like to use a standard way of naming objects so that it'll be easier to pass along databases from programmer to programmer. Our generally accepted notation is that we would use a descriptive name without spaces and capitalize the first letter of each word. We'll add a qualifier to the beginning to let us know what type of object it is, such as a table or a query. So an example for tables would be TBL to specify it's a table, and then we'll capitalize the first letter of the word customers. And for query, we will use QRY to specify it's a query, and then we'll capitalize, again, the first letter of each word. So our object names can contain letters, numbers, and special characters. They have to be less than 64 characters, which usually is not a problem, cannot start with a space, and cannot have periods, exclamation marks, accent graves, or brackets. Right, so naming fields within a table, we want to provide a name for every field. And we'll make a descriptive name with no spaces. Again, we'll capitalize the first letter of each word. Although Access will allow spaces in field names, it can cause issues with more advanced features, so we'll try to stay away from using spaces in field names. And we'll see later how to add a caption so that we can create more readable names for our column headers in the data sheet. Let's talk a little bit about field types. You should be aware that when you have different field types that can affect how your data is imported into Access, and you'll want to check your data anytime you import it to make sure that your data was read in properly, and if not, you might consider trying a different field type. So we have different field types for text, both long and short text. And then for numeric field types, we'll see that we have a variety of field sizes in a moment. We may have date time field types, currency. An auto number is generated by Access, and it is often used if you want Access to create a primary key for you. The yes/no field, those are Boolean values, and in Access, a -1 represents yes and a 0 represents no. We'll see this in a demonstration in a moment. We're not going to work so much with OEL objects, but that is a type of field. Hyperlinks and attachments are fields as well. We will not be working with those as much. We will be doing some calculated fields. Right, as I mentioned, for numbers, we have different field sizes, and you'll notice that as we move through this list from top to bottom, that we have an increase in the field size in terms of its storage space. And so it's best to use the smallest field size that's necessary, so we don't have unnecessary storage space reserved. I wouldn't expect you to memorize all of these exact values, but just more or less to be aware that a byte would be the smallest field size. And then we have some field sizes specific for integers and then for decimal values as well. Okay, so we want to be mindful of field types because if our field size is too small, the data can't be stored properly. And if our field size is too large, the database will grow unnecessarily large. And we talked about the auto number is useful for primary keys. Access will automatically generate those for us. And if we have a numeric ID variable, that could be read in as either text or a long integer. And if you're importing data, you might just check if your long integer for some reason does not read in well, then you might try the text option. For fields with numbers and letters, you would have to use the text option. All right, so I'm going to move into Excel and I'm going to show you some data that we're going to import. And we're going to import this data with different field types and we're going to see what difference it makes. So let's open up this Excel spreadsheet. And notice here that I have the same values in all of these columns, A through E. And we're going to read them in using these different field types as specified in the column header and see how that looks when we bring it into Access. Right now there's no special format for these values. They're all just formatted as general in Excel. So these column headers really only are there to remind me when I read them into Access which field type to use. The last two columns are also identical. We're going to read them in both as a yes/no field type and then also as a short text field type. All right, so let's go into Access. And I'm just going to create a blank database. I'm not worried about saving this, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the name. And I'm going to import data, so external data and Excel. And later I'll walk you through importing a data file. Right now my main purpose is to show you how these field types read in. And let's see, test data types, okay. And I'm going to leave that box checked. And now I have the chance to change these field types. So this first column I'm going to read in as single. I'm going to leave this column in as double. Decimal is not an option here. We're just going to kind of disregard this column for now. I'm going to read this in as long integer. Here, currency. This I will read in as yes/no. We're going to get some import errors on this one, and we'll talk about that in a moment. I'll leave this as short text. I'm not going to create a primary key for this demonstration. It's not necessary. And finish. I'm not going to worry about saving those import steps. And now I have some new tables that are created over here. This table 1, I'm just going to delete it. That's just auto created when I opened a new database. And here is the data sheet, and we can see how these columns all look different even though they all started off the same. So our single data type, we only have 7 significant digits, and so it just rounded at the end. For the double, it goes up to 15 significant digits, and so it was able to contain the entire numerical value. This one, just disregard, we didn't do anything with that. For the long integer, we just rounded to the nearest integer. And then for currency, you can see it rounded to the nearest cent. And let's come back to yes/no. For short text, everything read in as it looked in the original file. For the yes/no column, I'm going to come over here to this import errors. This table was generated because Access was not happy with some of our values in the yes/no field. It wasn't happy with the values in rows 2 through 7, and so the type conversion failed. So let's look back at rows 2 through 7. All right, and so you'll see actually this represents what was in the original file. And for the yes/no, we really only want to see zeros and ones. It didn't really know how to work with this text values, and so it just converted to a 0, but we were told that that was an import error. For these values, Excel treats 1 as a yes, and Access treats it as a -1. So when it read in that 1, it changed it to a -1, which means yes in Access, and then the zeros read in as zeros correctly. So this gives you an idea of how your data may look different depending on the field type that you choose, and you should be mindful of that. And after you import your data, you should do some checks to make sure it imported correctly and did not leave off important pieces of your data. You might consider sorting them and looking for unusual values, maybe negative values, 0 values, or blank values, to make sure you did capture the data that you wanted to import.